In the quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon, life had a way of slipping into predictable rhythms. A man named Daniel lived alone in a modest two-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a brick complex that had stood since the 1970s. He worked long hours as a data analyst for a tech firm, returning home most evenings to a simple dinner and the company of his German shepherd, Max. The dog was loyal, intelligent, and usually fearless. For Daniel, who had gone through a recent divorce, Max was more than just a pet. He was family, a reason to feel safe in an otherwise empty apartment. The apartment itself had little to distinguish it from 100 others in the building. Beige walls, squeaky floors, a faint smell of old wood in the hallways. Yet it had one oddity that visitors often noticed: a strangely shadowed corner in the living room opposite the television. Even during the day, when the sun streamed through the blinds, the corner seemed to remain dim, as if light resisted touching it. Daniel brushed it off as poor architecture, maybe some trick of angles and lighting. It was never more than a mild curiosity. Max, however, noticed something else about that corner. At first, Daniel thought it was a quirk. The way the dog would occasionally sit in the middle of the room, ears raised, eyes locked on that patch of shadow. But over the weeks, Max's behavior grew stranger. Each night, almost precisely after midnight, Max would rise from his spot at Daniel's feet, pad slowly toward the corner, and stand rigid. His body would tense, tail stiff, a low growl vibrating from his chest. Sometimes he would whine softly, as if torn between curiosity and fear. Daniel tried to reassure himself. Perhaps the dog heard something from the neighboring apartment, or caught the scent of mice on the walls. Yet no matter what explanation he offered, Max's gaze never wavered. It was always the same spot, the same corner. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Daniel watched Max again take his post in front of the shadowed corner. The dog trembled, his teeth bared, a sound closer to a snarl than a growl rising in his throat. Daniel felt a ripple of unease crawl down his spine. He told himself it was nothing, but that night he slept uneasily, stirred awake by the sound of Max pacing back and forth, always circling back to stare into the darkness. It was the first night Daniel dreamed of the corner. In his sleep he saw a figure, tall, indistinct, more like smoke than flesh, leaning out of the shadow, watching with eyes he could not fully see but could feel. He woke with his sheets damp from sweat and Max whimpering at the side of the bed. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the irrational urge to turn on every light in the apartment. And for the first time, he wondered if Max wasn't imagining something at all. Over the following nights, Daniel's attention fixed more and more on Max's strange ritual. The clock would approach midnight, and without fail, the dog would stiffen, rise, and face the corner. It became so predictable that Daniel began to dread the ticking of the clock as it neared that hour. The more Daniel watched, the more he noticed subtle things he had once overlooked. When Max stood guard, the apartment grew unnaturally quiet. The hum of the refrigerator dulled. The traffic outside seemed distant. Even the rain against the windows sometimes appeared muted. It was as though the world itself held its breath whenever the dog's eyes settled into the shadows. One night, Daniel sat in his recliner with the television flickering in front of him. Max was asleep at his feet, twitching slightly as he dreamed. The clock struck 12. In a single instant, Max's eyes shot open. He leapt to his feet and darted to the corner, body bristling, growl low and constant. Daniel muted the TV. The silence that followed was suffocating. He strained his ears but heard nothing beyond Max's growl. The corner seemed darker than usual, the shadows denser, as if gravity itself pulled light into that one spot. Daniel stood slowly, heart pounding. He moved closer to the corner, whispering reassurances to himself even though he had sworn not to speak aloud. He raised a hand and flicked on the lamp nearest the wall. The pool of yellow light illuminated the beige paint, the faint scuff marks, the skirting board at the floor. Yet somehow, the shadows did not fully retreat. The edges remained dark, refusing to surrender to the light. That night, Daniel could not bring himself to sleep in the bedroom. Instead, he lay on the couch with Max curled beside him, both of them facing the corner. He drifted into a shallow sleep, broken by dreams of whispers. Voices he could not recognize seemed to call his name from far away, distorted, layered, as if more than one person spoke at once. He woke at dawn with a splitting headache and Max staring fixedly at the same place. By the end of the week, the situation had worsened. Max no longer limited his strained behavior to midnight. Sometimes during the day he would pause mid-meal, ears snapping upright, then trot to the corner with his tail tucked, staring and trembling. He no longer wanted to be left alone in the apartment. If Daniel left for work, neighbors reported hearing the dog barking incessantly until exhaustion silenced him. Daniel tried to rationalize, but his body betrayed him. He had begun waking at the exact same time each night, 3:13 a.m., with a cold sweat and the sensation of being watched. He would sit up in bed, pulse racing, and find Max already awake, head resting on the edge of the mattress, eyes locked toward the living room. Always the corner. Always the same spot. Sleep deprivation set in. The once bright, analytical man now looked gaunt, shadows carved under his eyes, his mind dulled. At work, he found himself staring blankly at his computer screen, unable to recall what he had been doing moments before. His co-worker suggested he see a doctor, but he laughed it off. Inside, though, he felt the gnawing truth. Something was wrong in that apartment. Something Max sensed long before he did. And then came the first sound. It was a Friday night, late, when Daniel sat on the couch nursing a cup of coffee, too tired to think, too wired to sleep. Max suddenly shot to his feet, tail bristling, and began a deep, guttural growl at the corner. Daniel turned half, expecting to see the same nothingness. But this time, the silence cracked. From the corner came a faint scrape, like fingernails dragging slowly down the wall. Daniel froze. The sound stopped after a second, leaving the room smothered in stillness again. Max barked sharply once, twice, his hackles raised. Daniel forced himself to move forward, step by trembling step, and pressed his palm against the wall. It was cool, unremarkable. Yet as his hand lingered, he swore he felt a vibration beneath the paint, a low hum, almost like a pulse. That night, he slept with the lights on. Daniel's exhaustion grew unbearable. A week of restless nights had drained him, leaving his thoughts fragmented, his patience threadbare. He considered moving out of the apartment, but something irrational anchored him there. He told himself he couldn't afford it, that finding a new lease would be difficult, that the corner was only a coincidence. Yet, deep down, he knew there was another reason, a need to understand what plagued both him and Max. One night, around midnight, he sat in the dim glow of the television. Max lay at his feet, restless, his body twitching as though bracing for something unseen. The dog stirred suddenly, ears snapping upright. Without hesitation, Max bounded toward the living room corner and planted himself in front of it, snarling with a ferocity Daniel had never heard before. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. He muted the television, and silence spread like a suffocating fog. Then it came, the sound again, a faint scratching, steady this time, deliberate. It wasn't the random scuttle of a rodent. It was rhythmic, almost purposeful, like something clawing its way closer from behind the wall. Daniel stood, every nerve screaming at him to flee, yet his body disobeyed. He approached, step by step, the scratching louder with each movement. He turned on the standing lamp beside the corner, flooding the space with light. The wall revealed nothing unusual, plain beige, the faint outline of plaster seams. But Max's growl rose to a fever pitch, and then suddenly the dog stopped. Daniel blinked. In the lamp's glow, he saw it. A shadow that didn't belong. It clung to the corner, darker than it should have been, stretching faintly upward like the silhouette of a figure. But there was no figure to cast it. The outline suggested height, a long frame, and a head that tilted unnaturally to one side. The air grew heavy, pressing against Daniel's chest, making it hard to breathe. His skin prickled with a cold sweat as he stared at the impossible shadow. He squeezed his eyes shut, rubbed them, and looked again. The shape remained. Max lunged forward suddenly, snapping his teeth at the empty air. His bark echoed through the apartment, frantic, enraged. The shadow pulsed as though it breathed. Then in an instant, it melted back into the corner, swallowed by the darkness. The light hummed above Daniel's head, flickering once, twice, before stabilizing. He staggered backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table, his heart slamming against his ribs. For a long moment, he couldn't move, couldn't think, only stand and watch as Max continued to bark into emptiness. When the dog finally relented, panting and trembling, Daniel scooped him into his arms, something he hadn't done since Max was a pup. They sat together on the couch until dawn, both refusing to look away from the corner. The next morning, Daniel convinced himself it had been exhaustion, an optical illusion created by a sleep-deprived mind. He clung to that explanation, fragile as it was, through the day. Yet, as night returned, a gnawing dread filled his stomach. He avoided the living room as long as he could, lingering in the bedroom with the lights blazing, the television loud. But eventually, he stepped back into the living room and saw Max already waiting, eyes locked, body trembling. The shadow was waiting, too. The following nights descended into a torment Daniel could no longer rationalize. What began as fleeting glimpses of shadow soon grew into full manifestations that seemed to feed on his fear. The corner no longer looked like a trick of the eye. It had become a wound in the room, a place where light bent and sound died, an opening into something that was not supposed to exist. Max grew worse with every encounter. The once fearless shepherd now shook constantly after dark. His eyes followed the corner as if tracking movement invisible to Daniel's eyes. He refused to eat at night, standing guard instead, hackles raised until exhaustion overtook him. Daniel tried to drag him away, to shut him inside the bedroom, but Max would whine and scratch at the door until he was allowed back to his vigil. It was as though the dog had sworn himself to a duty, to protect Daniel from whatever lurked within that darkness. Then came the first true contact. It was well past midnight when Daniel woke to the sound of Max barking with such ferocity it rattled the windows. He stumbled from the bedroom, heart hammering, and froze at the sight before him. Max stood just inches from the corner, barking wildly at the shadow that had grown impossibly large, stretching almost to the ceiling. Daniel reached for the light switch, but before his fingers touched it, the air shifted. A violent cold swept through the apartment, so sharp it burned his lungs. And then, in the flickering glow of the lamp, Daniel saw movement. The shadow leaned outward. It did not step forward nor emerge from the wall, but bent at an impossible angle, as though the corner itself stretched to release it. The outline of a head, elongated and distorted, extended into the room. The body was skeletal, arms too long, ending in points that scraped the wall as they moved. Its face remained featureless, yet Daniel felt its gaze settle on him with the weight of 1,000 eyes. He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, his body paralyzed between fight and flight. Max lunged, snapping at the darkness, his teeth clamping on nothing but air. Yet the shadow recoiled as if wounded, folding back into itself, shrinking suddenly until it was once again just a patch of darkness on the wall. The apartment fell silent. Daniel collapsed on the floor, gasping, sweat dripping from his forehead. Max circled the corner, barking for minutes on end, refusing to turn his back to it. From that night onward, the rules of the apartment had changed. Lights flickered constantly, bulbs bursting without cause. Objects shifted slightly when Daniel left the room, as though nudged by unseen hands. Cold spots spread through the apartment, lingering no matter how high he turned the heat. He caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision. A shadow passing quickly when no one else was there, a tall shape reflected in the darkened television screen when he stood alone. And always the feeling of being watched. It no longer came only at night. Even in broad daylight, with the sun pouring through the blinds, Daniel felt eyes on him, heavy and unrelenting. Max, too, was changing. The dog barked less now, his defiance slowly giving way to a quiet dread. Sometimes he would simply sit before the corner and whimper softly, glancing back at Daniel with eyes that seemed to beg him to leave. But Daniel could not leave. He knew it now. The presence in the corner had fixed itself to him. If he ran, it would follow. The apartment was no longer a home. It was a cage, and the shadow was its keeper. And soon, Daniel realized it was no longer content to remain in the corner. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of sleeplessness and dread. Daniel's body weakened, his mind unraveling. He had stopped going to work altogether, too afraid to leave the apartment for long. His fridge was nearly empty, his phone full of unanswered messages. But none of that mattered. All that mattered was the corner, and the thing that had claimed it. It no longer waited until midnight. Now, the shadows seeped into every hour, twisting the apartment into something unrecognizable. At first, it was subtle. The feeling of movement when Daniel blinked, the faint hum in the walls that grew louder each day. But soon it became undeniable. The figure emerged more often, no longer shy about showing itself. It would lean outward, stretching its impossibly thin body across the wall, its head cocked in silent observation. Daniel stopped trying to tell himself it wasn't real. He knew it was. He knew it was alive. Max never left his side. The dog had grown gaunt from missed meals, his fur bristling constantly, his body wound tight as a spring. At night, he would stand between Daniel and the corner, his body trembling, a low growl vibrating endlessly from his throat. Daniel sometimes wondered if Max understood more than he did, if the dog had always known what was waiting in the dark. Then came the final night. It was raining hard, sheets of water slamming against the apartment windows. The storm howled outside, but inside, the air was heavier, thicker, suffused with something unnatural. Daniel sat in the living room with every lamp burning, every bulb glowing bright. Yet the corner remained just as dark as ever, impervious to the light. At 3:13 a.m., the moment that had haunted him for weeks, the lamps flickered. One by one, the bulbs shattered with sharp pops, plunging the room into darkness. Daniel fumbled for his phone, its weak glow the only light left. Max barked furiously, lunging toward the corner, teeth bared, body rigid with rage. And then the shadow stepped out. This time it did not cling to the wall. It peeled away from it, stretching into the room, tall and skeletal, its limbs contorting unnaturally as it moved. Its faceless head tilted, and the weight of its gaze crushed Daniel to the couch. The air was icy, burning his lungs with every breath. His phone flickered and died, leaving him in complete blackness, except for the outline of the thing. Max attacked. With a feral snarl, the dog leapt at the figure, snapping wildly. The sound of claws on hardwood echoed as Max collided with the darkness. For a moment, Daniel thought he saw the figure stagger, recoiling from the assault. But then, faster than sight, the shadow wrapped around the dog, engulfing him in a mass of writhing black. Max yelped, the sound sharp and desperate, before being dragged into the corner. Daniel screamed, scrambling forward, reaching for his companion. His fingers closed on nothing but cold air. The corner was empty again. Max was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. The apartment felt hollow, stripped of warmth. Daniel stood shaking, staring at the empty space where his dog had been. And then, from the corner, came the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, and human. It was closer now. The figure did not retreat this time. It lingered in the corner, tall and waiting, its outline clear even in the darkness. Daniel felt its presence pressing against him, suffocating, inevitable. He realized then what Max had always known. The dog hadn't been protecting him from the corner. He had been buying Daniel time. But now the time had run out. As dawn crept into sky outside, the apartment remained shrouded in shadow. Neighbors would later recall hearing a final scream, muffled by the storm, followed by silence. Daniel never answered his phone again, never showed up at work, never picked up his mail. His apartment remained locked, lights burned out, the air inside unnaturally cold. And in the living room, in that same unlit corner, the shadows still seemed deeper than they should have been.